Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today, we're continuing our ongoing coverage of the war between the Russian Federation and the Ukraine. Now, today specifically, I want to start off in the area to the northeast of Kharkov and just south of Belgorod. The mainstream media here in the United States, the European Union, information coming out of the Pentagon is that because of the additional U.S. support in terms of weapons and what have you to the Ukrainians, that the offensive designed to seize control of Kharkov has stalled. Now, here's the problem with that statement. There was no offensive designed to seize control of Kharkov. The operations that the Russians are conducting are to the northeast of Kharkov. If there would have been a sustained Russian drive with additional forces that, by the way, are massing in the area south of Belgorod, further to the west near Sumy, we would have seen additional operations by the Russians, specifically coming down the E-105. And we would have also seen Russian offensive operations further to the west as well. We would have seen a classic pincer maneuver designed to conduct double enveloping operations around Kharkov. But we're not seeing that. We're strictly seeing Russian offensive operations to the northeast of Kharkov, centered on the town of Vovchansk. And yes, there is very heavy fighting taking place as we speak in and around this town. The Russians seem to be stopping along this riverbank, or this minor creek/river that runs between the more heavily urbanized area of Vovchansk and the more single-family dwelling areas of Volchansk, with one area specifically that has fairly large industry. But the built-up area of Vovchansk is this area just to the north of the Vovcha River. And you can clearly see that the Russians are taking territory in what appears to be an effort to establish a buffer zone. We know that Ukrainian forces have been attacking targets in Belgorod, and at the start of this operation, the Russians announced that it was creating a buffer zone, not a drive to seize control of Kharkov. Again, we would see additional movements, and this operation would have been much, much larger. But additionally, this operation served two goals. One, to create a buffer zone, and secondly, and probably more important, was to draw Ukrainian forces, draw the Ukrainian battlefield reserve to this area to prevent a possible Russian breakthrough. Because remember, at the start of this offensive, the Ukrainians weren't entirely certain that the Russians wouldn't try an attack directly on Kharkov. So we saw these additional Ukrainian reserve forces that were designed to prevent a breakthrough and possible preparations for future-facing counteroffensive operations. Those forces were redeployed northeast of Kharkov. And to this day, those forces are locked in pitched battles with Russian forces, while at the same time, the Russian Air Force is using guided glide bombs to attack and reduce these Ukrainian forces that have been deployed to this area. Now, additionally, the Russian offensive in other areas is continuing. So we have to go down to Donetsk, and this is very important because this Russian operation to the northeast of Donetsk, to the northeast of Avdiivka, after the Avdiivka nut was cracked, those operations continue. And we have to go to the other map, the deep state map, where I can show you exactly what has transpired over the course of the last 2 weeks. So this was May 30th. Now I'm going to fast forward this where you, the viewer, can see exactly how this methodical Russian drive is continuing. Here we go. So there you have it. The Russians are not being pushed back. The Russians are continuing offensive operations. More importantly, it is now being reported that Russian forces running from the Crimean Peninsula, just south of Kherson, all the way to the north-northeast towards operations that are taking place in and around to the north-northeast of Kharkov. Russian forces combined totals in terms of manpower now exceed well over 600,000 troops. Right now it is reported that there are now upwards to 700,000 Russian troops reportedly deployed in this special operation military zone. And that force construct is going to continue to get bigger. Remember, every month the Russian military is growing by about 35,000 to 40,000 troops. Essentially, one additional army corps every month is coming online within the scope of the Russian ground forces. Now, we're also hearing that the Ukrainians are going to start the deployment of the vaunted F-16. The F-16 is going to be deployed by the Ukrainians. Now, I have to imagine that the number one priority now for the Russian military, once these F-16s are deployed, will be for the Russian military to shoot down one of these or a number of these F-16s, or launch hypersonic missile attacks against airfields in western Ukraine, targeting the air bases that are housing these F-16s or basing these F-16s. It would be very, very probable to see a Zircon or other very fast, very hard to hit, hard to detect missile system used by the Russians to attack some of these air bases in the West, and specifically try to go after a grounded U.S.-made F-16. We've already seen multiple M1A1 Abrams main battle tanks be destroyed and then captured and then sent to Moscow on full display for the Moscow populace to have a look-see at one of these main battle tanks. And they're there. A multitude of them. A multitude of M1A1 Abrams, a multitude of Leopard 2 main battle tanks, and a host of other Western-made systems are on full display in Moscow right now for all to see. If you're an American, you want to take a trip to Moscow, you can go see this, what is turned into a Western display amusement park of damaged and destroyed Western equipment. But again, the big issue right now, at least in terms of the long-term outlook on this conflict, is number one, the Russians are not going to quit. They're not going to stop. At the very minimum, at the very, very minimum, to conclude this conflict, the Ukrainians would have to turn over Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and Luhansk. I, for one, don't believe the Russians are going to stop this conflict until there is a breakthrough, there is a general collapse of the eastern Ukrainian forces, and the Russians are able to take control of the second largest city of Ukraine, and that is Kharkov. I firmly believe that going into this conflict, based on how Russian forces entered the Ukraine, one of the main goals for Russian forces was the seizure of Kharkov and lands to the west of Kharkov as well. So again, this will probably go on for some time until Kharkov is also surrendered or taken by Russian forces. It seems more logical as well that if the Ukrainians continue this conflict, and we continue to see the buildup of Russian forces, the enlargement of the Russian military, the continued airborne strikes by the Russian Air Force against Ukrainian targets. And look, about between 100 and 150 aim points are being hit a day, and in some cases 3,000 plus aim points are being hit a month by Russian forces with these glide bombs, these very large, powerful glide bombs that the Russians are using. Now, what's interesting, and I've talked about this topic before, that the Ukrainians are stating that, well, the Russians only use cruise missiles and these glide bombs against civilian targets. Look, the Ukrainians themselves are saying about 12,000 civilians have died in this conflict in well over 2 years of war. And I've said this before, if the Russian goal was to cause civilian casualties, the death toll in the civilian population in eastern Ukraine and other parts of Ukraine would be vastly higher. You're talking about upwards to 100,000 Ukrainian civilians killed if the Russians were truly seeking large-scale civilian casualties. We're not seeing that. We have not seen Kharkov devastated and rubbleized. We have not seen other cities, such as Lviv, destroyed and rubbleized. And that's not happening. So we know that based on that information, based on casualty levels and what really the Russians are targeting, are military areas, are military targets that the Russians are going after. The Russians have attempted to the best of their ability, to reduce and mitigate the loss of civilian lives. Now, I will also say that the Ukrainians, on their part, could have reduced and rubbleized Donetsk. They had that ability. They have that capability. And we haven't seen the Ukrainians do that as well. So you can see the relative closeness between these two people. Again, there's a lot of talk about this separation between Ukrainian and Russian. Ukrainian and Russian. But the fact is, most Ukrainians speak Russian. A minority of quote-unquote Ukrainians speak actual Ukrainian. Look, even Zelensky does not speak quote-unquote Ukrainian very well. He is a Russian speaker. These people that are fighting are essentially Russians. Now, yes, there are Ukrainians in the West that speak Ukrainian. But for the most part, especially in eastern Ukraine, these are Russians. They're not Ukrainians. Russian. They speak Russian, they have a Russian culture, and they have very close ties to people living in Russia. Many were born in Russia. Many Russians that reside now in Russia were born in the Ukraine. They're the same people. And that is why the Russians really put their foot down when the West was trying to bring this group, this nation state, into the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The Russians have said, no, nope, not going to happen. You've gone too far. And this is where we sit. And this is why the Russians are not going to stop this conflict. It's not going to stop. It will continue until the Western-backed NATO forces of the forces that are fighting against the Russians in the Ukraine are defeated. And it will happen. And at some point, could we see an escalation? Will we see the deployment of tactical nuclear weapons? Well, NATO is now talking about upping its ready status for the use of tactical nuclear weapons. The Russians right now are training in the use of, yes, tactical nuclear weapons. So again, the war is escalating. Slowly but surely. We will probably get to the point where there will be a direct engagement between NATO forces and the Russian Federation, meaning fighting taking place elsewhere besides the territory of what is now being called the Ukraine. More to come. As always, thank you for joining us. Have a good day.